Hello, and welcome to the continuation of our morality course on DVD. This is segment 5, and in this segment we're going to talk about conscience and conscience formation. I want to start with, I guess, a kind of a moral dilemma, and it's a situation that maybe a lot of people face, just, kind of relax and listen to this situation. Say you're the mother or the father of a teenage daughter, 16-year-old. She's your youngest child, and you are a Catholic, a longtime Catholic, maybe an older person who's seen the changes in the church and likes a lot of the new things, but sometimes feels like the world is running away with things a little bit, and things are getting confusing. And your daughter comes to you and says that her and her steady boyfriend are having sex pretty regularly, intercourse pretty regularly. And despite your anger or you're upset about this, she says she's not going to stop seeing him or stop having sex. And what she's asking for is some birth control pills. What would you do? This is at least for some people, would be a difficult moral situation. Now, I know you could kind of press the easy button and shoot the guy, or put her in jail, or him in jail, or whatever else. But just kind of set aside those options and just think, how would or could you deal with this as a parent? That's kind of our issue in terms of conscience. We'll come back to this situation, but let me kind of move from that situation to talking about conscience a little bit, what it is. In the Catechism, it describes conscience in paragraph 1777, and it talks about how conscience is using our judgment to recognize the right, using our reason to recognize the right. Conscience is kind of an inner voice. It's really the power of the Holy Spirit residing within us. And the church tries to help us see that our conscience doesn't determine what's good or evil for us, but it helps us to recognize what is already out there that is good or evil. So we stay away from this idea that whatever we think is right, and whatever we think is wrong is wrong. It's more how we discern. I guess in a way, our conscience doesn't decide good or evil, but discerns good or evil. And that's probably a little bit of a distinction that might be really important for us to remember. It helps us to apply the moral principles that are there. Now, in this birth control situation, although there's a lot of conflicting values here, your love for your daughter, you realizing you may not be able to control the situation, you don't want your daughter to run away from home, trying to maintain good communication with your daughter, that really, all that, your those feelings and that pull on one side, and the really strong church teaching, our belief as Catholics that birth control is morally wrong. So in this case, you'd have to really make that application that birth control is morally wrong and find some way to break through to your daughter. There may be other situations where it's not as clear, the rightness and wrongness of the issue But in this case, it's pretty clear. But I think a lot of people maybe really have difficulties these days with situations like that. We'll come back to that again. But I hope you can see how what we're really talking about here is looking at the God-given principles of morality that we have through the church, and trying to find ways in the messiness of life to apply those, to act on those. And it can really be a challenge. The church talks about, though, when we're looking at morality and we're looking at conscience, there's three fonts of morality, or three sources, or three aspects of every moral decision that are in play. And it's traditionally called the three fonts of morality. The first aspect of morality is the act, of course. And the question we ask ourselves, is the act good or evil? Good is that which preserves or uplifts life, human life, and all life, ultimately. Evil is that which destroys or oppresses or impedes human life. And, I think you could look at it in the case of killing. Obviously, killing a human being is an evil thing. But there might be situations where it might not be evil, or the evil might not be the only thing you consider, at least. It's always evil, but it might not be the only thing you consider. And I think human beings, and the Catechism really doesn't say this straightforwardly, but I think it's really implied that human beings have an innate sense of good and evil. And that's where our conscience comes from. Well, another source of morality is the intention. And we have to look at the intention is, what's in your heart as you do an act. Or do you intend this good or this evil? Going back to the case of killing, which is in itself an evil act, if you don't intend it, it's still evil, but there's not the moral culpability there. Say you're driving and someone steps out in front of your car and you kill that person. You've still done something that's killed someone, but you didn't intend it. It was an accident. And that plays into the whole situation here. The next font of morality are the circumstances. The circumstances can affect, even though the act of killing someone is evil, the circumstances affect the culpability. For instance, you're driving along and someone tries to carjack your car. Well, maybe what happens is you speed away, or you hit the person with something, or you drive them off and it causes their death. You're defending, you really are you're intending to do the person harm. It is an evil act, but because of the circumstances, there's not the level of moral culpability. I think we can look at these in another way, maybe a simpler way too. Is slapping someone good or evil? I think on the surface we have to say it's evil. But if you're trying to revive someone who's just maybe had a seizure or something, well, you could see it as a necessary act to do. The circumstances really change it. Or giving someone a gift. Is that good or evil? Well, it's a good thing to give someone a gift. But if you're giving someone a gift that's actually a bribe, maybe you're bribing a politician to do something wrong, then the intention makes what would be a good act on the surface really a morally culpable kind of thing. It's an immoral act. So we can see that all three of these really come into play. However, we have to really emphasize that it's the act that really is the most important of these three things. And an intrinsically evil act, like, say, rape or torture, would override the circumstances and would override the intention. So there are certain acts that it doesn't matter what the circumstances are or what your intentions are. It's still morally culpable. There's no reason to do a certain act. The church would say that abortion is one of these intrinsically evil actions. The Catechism really emphasizes, and we could recognize this, it's just common sense, that our conscience needs to be formed. This is why we have parent education, why we would encourage parents to share faith with their kids in the home, teach the kids in the home. It's why we have Catholic schools and parish religious education programs. It's why we have homilies on Sunday. It's why we try to do all the adult faith formation we can, because we are responsible as human beings, but especially as Christians and Catholics, to form our conscience toward the good and to bring as much, put ourselves into contact with the truth of God's law as much as we can. And this takes some work. It's the kind of thing that this whole course is about, really, helping people discover the moral truths that lie within creation and within human beings. Now, poorly formed consciences, there's a lot of symptoms of poorly formed consciences. One would be laxity, someone who just really kind of doesn't have a conscience. They just do what they want. It doesn't seem to matter to them. I remember my daughter, when she was in high school, she would come home sometimes, or we would be sitting at the breakfast table, and she'd kind of complain that, well, she couldn't have as much fun as some of her friends did because somehow we had given her a sensitive conscience. And she was moaning about that, like, well, I can't do things without feeling guilty. And I'm going, as a parent, yes, because we really want to have a sensitive conscience to a certain extent, although not a scrupulous conscience. That's another sign of a poorly formed conscience, when someone thinks everything is wrong, everything they're doing is evil. There is such a thing as having too sensitive a conscience. A kind of a sentimentalist kind of conscience, where it's only how I feel, is another sign of a poorly formed conscience. Too much of a subjective approach in terms of conscience. What's right for me is right for me. What's right for you is right for you, but we may not agree. We would have to see, and our church really emphasized the fact that there is an objective moral law. It may be difficult to get to that sometimes, but we have to try to discover that. It's kind of what God has built into creation. If we are ignorant of, that's another sign of a poorly formed conscience, ignorance. Someone who just doesn't know anything. They would maybe respond if they knew, but they don't take the time to know anything about moral teachings or moral laws. It kind of lets you off the hook in a way, but it's not a good place to be in terms of being a responsible Christian or even a responsible human being. Legalism is another sign of a poorly formed conscience. It's all about the law. It's kind of that Pharisaical approach. So, again, we have to, as Christians, particularly in the world today where there's a lot of confusion, work hard to form our consciences well. Read particularly good Catholic literature, Christian literature, read the Scriptures, what's Jesus calling us to, and try to work as much as we can to have that good adult, mature conscience. The Church in the Catechism talks about a number of things that I think are going to help us here. I already mentioned the difference between good and evil, and I think that's really important to kind of put those labels on actions. I know sometimes we think about the word evil as this ultimate kind of satanic presence, but actually I think we can, really call an act evil by just determining, is it destructive of human life? Is it into oppressing people? Is it into destroying human life? Those are the kind of actions that are evil. And good uplifts human life. In the Catechism, they talk about pre-moral evil. The kind of evil that would happen as a result of what you could call acts of God, not really acts of God, just nature, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, forest fires, etc., that kill or destroy human beings and really create an evil that affects people's lives. That is evil, but the Church would say in the Catechism, it's pre-moral evil. There's no moral aspect to it. It's just something that happens. Moral evil is evil that's the result of a human act that's freely chosen. And as we mentioned when we talked about the act, the intention, the circumstances, even though sometimes you would have a situation where an evil act is done, it might be justified. So there are certain circumstances or possibly intentions where an evil act is justified. Killing in self-defense, for instance, would be an evil act that's justified. And so that's where our conscience really comes in. When would we justify this? Church teaching helps us out with this, but sometimes we still have to kind of discern where's the line where we would justify something like that. Sin is a term that's used in religious circles a lot. I think it applies to everyone. I don't think we would say that sin is only a matter for people who believe in God. I think human beings can commit sin. Any human being can commit a sin. As it's defined in the Catechism, sin is an evil act that's done freely with full knowledge. And so we can see that kind of includes those three fonts. As I mentioned before, there are certain acts that are intrinsically evil that are never justified. So those are the kinds of things that there's no clear list of those kind of things, but those are the kind of things that I think we could have a sense about. Abortion would be one. Murder would be one. Not just killing someone, but murder, torture. There's a number of other things, rape. The natural law is what our church tradition, the Catechism, and we ourselves can kind of sense as to determine what God's kind of built-in moral law is in the nature. Natural law is the kind of science of looking at the order of creation and from the order of creation determining what acts are good and what acts are evil. And the moral section, section 3 of the Catechism, really is kind of built on that. They make the application of natural law to human sexuality, make the application of natural law to respect life, to violence and war, and to social justice. So it's not just a matter of dreaming something up. Natural law is a real look at kind of how God is built in to who we are and creation, His moral law. Some of the things that we kind of derive from natural law that the church has out there in terms of moral principles are the dignity of the human being. Every human being has innate dignity. The sacredness of human life. Sexuality as God's gift. And we're going to get into these issues more later on. The 10 Commandments. the teaching of Jesus, social justice. All of these things kind of flow out of natural law and revelation and guide our consciences. There's a decision-making process that I want to clarify for you that the church would, I think, want us to follow in order to, A, form our conscience well, but also to, in every moral decision. But if we have a really difficult moral decision, say the kind of moral decision that we were looking at the beginning of this segment, what do I do? What do I do? Particularly someone that maybe wasn't that familiar with Catholic teachings on birth control would maybe be really perplexed by this. And so the decision-making process just is these steps that I'm going to enumerate for you and help you kind of get a sense of if you follow these steps, you're going to be forming your conscience and it's going to lead you to make the right decision. The first thing is to clarify the issue. And a lot of what that means is the act good or evil? What is natural law? What's the church teaching say about whether this act is good or evil? That might be the end of the process if you determine it's intrinsically evil. But if it's still a little hazy, a little gray, maybe not real clear, then you go on to what are the values in conflict here? It's kind of like making two lists. What happens if I do? What happens if I don't? This kind of leads to the next step, which is what are the consequences of doing or not doing? Or going this direction or going that way? Another step is, are there some alternatives that I could take in the birth control issue? Maybe there's some other things to do besides this way or that, give her birth control or say no, or maybe there's another way to approach this that might help everybody avoid this dilemma. The next step, and this really flows through the whole process, but especially the next step is to look at what the church tells us, either through the Catechism or contacting someone who's knowledgeable or some other reading or doing something online to find what does the church really help, how does the church teaching help us to make this decision. Seeking spiritual guidance, which might go along with discovering the church teaching. And finally, following your conscience. Now this might sound kind of surprising, but after all this, I think one of the things the church is telling us is, we can't know, and we can't write up in the Catechism or in our books every situation, every circumstance, every intention. So really, in paragraph 1782 of the morality section, it says that once you've done all these things, once you've followed this decision-making process, you need to follow your conscience. But your conscience needs to be well-formed, and you need to follow your conscience toward the good as best as you can determine that. A couple of little caveats here. There are situations where we end up being faced with two evils. Maybe in war, you're in a situation where it's kill or be killed. Sometimes that can happen in different situations in life. If you're faced with a situation of two evils, you try to choose the lesser of two evils. Sometimes there can be a double effect where you do a certain act toward the good, but it also has an evil effect to it. That can be very difficult. And again, our conscience has to guide us there. And the church finally tells us that the end does not justify the means. We can't just use any means necessary or that might work to reach what might be a good end, but might lead us through evil. The end does not justify the means. My advice for the person who's has a daughter who wants birth control is to say no. The church teachings are really clear there. I think what a yes would be giving that young person permission, or sort of a go ahead and keep it up. And that's not something you want to say to a young person. I think there is a time to take a moral stand, and I think the daughter might even appreciate that. They might appreciate some real clear guidance on this, as opposed to, if done lovingly, and try to not make it a closing down communications too much, but to try to reach out with one hand in care and love, but the other hand saying, no, this just isn't right. The consequences of saying yes to that request, I think, could be very, very severe, very severe. And the church is very clear, again, about the birth control issue, and I think even more serious for someone who's only 16. So as you can see, our conscience, we hear sometimes, let your conscience be your guide. This is where, in moral terms, it's where the rubber meets the road. So I hope this has clarified some of what we say as Catholics about morality, and what we say about our conscience. And hopefully you can take this and kind of make applications in your own life as to how to follow your conscience toward the good.